G'day guys, Alex Calder here. Now, today I want to discuss movement prep and the intricacies that um, go with movement prep. So, to get started, this presentation is catered towards a collegiate setting. So it may or may not be applicable to everything, whether it's a field setting or a private facility. But in this scenario, I've catered it for the collegiate setting. And again, this is my version of a movement prep. So this is based off experience, knowledge, as well as some research to back what I'm going to be talking about. So again, it may or may not be right, and it may or may not be the way that you choose to do it. But this is what works for me, and I'll go into it a little bit more. So what I'm going to be talking about is I'm going to break up my movement prep. And talk about the different elements and what I focus on and what I look for when I'm preparing athletes for the training session. So movement prep, also known as PAP. I know the football guys down at Purdue call it PAP, but you can call it anything you want, movement prep or warm up or whatever. It's all got the same focus and the same idea behind it. So the main reason why movement prep is the most important, obviously preparing the athletes for the training session or the event that's about to go ahead directly after. So it's also a test of movement competency. Obviously, if an athlete is not competent to move, this is going to help prepare them for it. And if they're obviously incredibly poor at movement, then you're going to have to make a decision and pull them out or go from there, take further steps, which I'll talk about a bit later. The third point, what you see here, screening. So for me, I'm using movement preparation or your warm-up for a screen as well, which I'm going to dive into a little bit in a second here. And I'll discuss the intricacies that follows with that. But then the overall main idea is to have injury reduction or prevention, whatever you want to call it, right? So before I dive too much into the movement prep and the basis of it, is I popped this slide in here. The role of a sports performance coach. Now, I find this slide very powerful because it's what I'm going to be talking about, and I'm going to wrap everything around and talk about why it relates to movement prep and the functions of movement prep in a little bit here. So I've put the roles in the order of priority. So number one, and it seems pretty obvious and pretty silly to even have to point out, but obvious reasons, no injury in training, okay? The role of a sports performance coach or strength and conditioning specialist, whatever you want to call yourself, no injuries in training. And that goes for, practice if you're in charge of the warm-up, as well as anything in the gym. You just can't have guys or girls, getting injuries in the gym. Right, then the next priority is to have an injury reduction or prevention. Obviously, there's some things you can or cannot prevent, but injury reduction is the main goal of your job. So you got to have the athlete's health is your number one priority here. To get the best out of your team or even athlete, if it's an individual sport, you got to have your best players out there. So the best team, and I will take Leicester City for example. They had very, very minimal injuries. They had their best squad out there almost every game of the season, and they won the league. Simply, they had their best team out every game. So it creates a good pattern, and it also, standardizes performance to a high level. So then the third priority there is athletic performance. It does play a big portion of your role, but it is not the most important. Now, the picture here that I've got from Fusion Sport. Now, this was something that Dr. Craig Duncan, one of the best sports scientists in Australia, works with Western Sydney as well as the Socceroos. Now, look, this is something that he presented. It was either last year's conference or the year before, the AACA conference. And this slide in particular, this picture that I pulled, is massive, and I've seen the difference since being in America is compliance plays a massive role in the athlete's performance. So something that goes on in the collegiate setting, it's almost a tier system. So you've got your sports coaches here, then your positional coaches, then your strength and conditioning specialist, and then maybe nutritionist down the bottom, right? And each one goes up as a boss. Whereas if you look at this picture here, this is almost an umbrella setting, so everyone falls under the sports science window. You've got your athletes, you've got your strength and conditioning specialists, you've got your medical staff, you've got your coaches, then you've got your sports science analysts. Now, in the collegiate setting, you probably don't have your sports science analyst in there, so we'll wipe him out just for the sake of the argument. So you've got these four, and also you're going to have your nutrition too, but I'll probably just pop that in medical, but there's going to be a nutritional staff as well. So to get the best out of the athletes and to make sure that you're doing your roles is a level of compliance. Is everyone complying with each other? Let's take, for example, if an athlete's got a bit of a niggle or a tweak or something like that, to pull the hammy or whatnot, it's their role to communicate to the strength and conditioning specialist, to communicate to the athletic trainer, as well as the sport coaches, so that they can all work together. So if they need to implement something into the training program, everyone's aware of it. It's not something that's like, the sport coach says this and you have to pass this on, and then it turns out that the sports coach is telling you how to be an exercise scientist. Whereas this umbrella format is the most effective way of ensuring compliance amongst the sports medicine window. Now again, I'm going to touch on this a bit later of why this plays a role in the warm-up and what I'm going to be talking about. So I break my movement prep into 4 properties, and this is based on, again, priority. So number 1, tissue quality. Number 2, tissue length. Number 3, tissue and neural activation. And then number 4, tissue temperature. So I'm going to be talking about these 4 properties and the importance of each one in the next coming slides here. So first one, tissue quality. So this refers to the fascia, and when I talk about tissue, I'm going to be talking about fascia as well as muscle, so all sorts of connective tissue there, but mainly fascia, because that's the real thing that's going on here, and that's the real thing that's manipulating movement. So the idea in the tissue quality setting is to manipulate the fascia. So if you're not sure what fascia is, it's just a web-like sheet that covers a muscle, and you can see a nice little picture of it here. So by manipulating fascia, you can alleviate pain, and I've got some research to back some things there that shows that simple fascial manipulation can decrease the lower back injury pain, as well as shoulder pain in a short-term and long-term setting. So this is why I hit this first. But then, so let's picture this. If you've got what athletes call a knot, which it's a dysfunction in your fascia. So just like a muscle, it's almost like an elastic band. And if you've got a knot in that and you try and pull it, it's just going to get tighter and it's just going to get worse. So if you manipulate the fascia prior to any sort of movement or any sort of stretching, you're going to get that knot out, and you're going to create a better function of fascia contractility and stretch quality. So I've got that bullet point in there. It's going to enhance the stretch quality of it by manipulating it prior. And then, like I just said, it's going to ensure those contractile abilities, which will then prepare the body, prepare the fascia and muscle for the loaded capacity that's going to be happening in the session, regardless if it's sprint, regardless if it's high load and lower velocity, like max squats. Regardless what the session is, manipulating the fascia and ensuring that you're getting a better stretch reflex, you're getting better contractile abilities, is the number one portion of my movement preparation. So the next part is the tissue length portion. So the idea of this is to lengthen, shorten muscle groups. Now I use the word shorten rather than tight, because depending on the athlete's lifestyle and habits, big muscle groups can become shortened. Now, I've put hip flexors right here, so this plays a massive role. I want to touch on this right now, actually. So 90% of athletes are taking 4 or more classes, so they're sitting in a classroom 10 hours a week, then they're going studying another 10-15 hours a week, then they've got to put it blunt, they're sitting in a chair a lot of the time. So there's a very, very large majority of these collegiate athletes have tight hip flexors. So something that I focus on specifically in this movement prep property, tissue length, is I'm generally going to try and lengthen those hip flexors. And by lengthening those hip flexors, after manipulating the fascia around the muscle, is it's going to prevent the tissue adhesion. So what I was talking about, if you don't manipulate the fascia and then you try and lengthen the muscle, it's going to be quite, if the fascia is matted, and that's a lot of the terms that are taken from these studies, if the tissue's matted and the fascia is matted and you try and stretch it, it's gonna you're not going to get the best quality out of your tissue, and you're not going to be able to get the highest force of contractile forces out of it. So here's a picture here taken from this study. It's obviously not an exact muscle, but it gives you an idea of the collagen fibers on the muscle. So the one on the left here is a good quality muscle with good length to it, as well as good function of the fascia. And then this was a picture of what they would call matted fascia. So fascia that's not looked after, that hasn't been manipulated anyway. So let me make it clear, by manipulation I talk about, it's pretty simple: foam rollers and lacrosse balls and med balls, or whatever you want to use. So this is how it looks if you don't manipulate the fascia. So imagine trying to stretch or trying to lengthen these muscles when they're matted down like this. It just doesn't happen. And then you've just got, your elastic storage is just not at its full capability when they're matted and shortened like that. So then the next portion of what I got here is tissue and neuron activation. So this property of the warm-up is to activate and get certain muscles firing, as well as waking up the nervous system. So I've put these two together, although they're two separate things. So for example, you look here, I've got the Socceroos doing their mini band or crab walks, or whatever you want to call it, lateral walks, to wake up their hip external rotators, so the glute med. So by doing this prior to any sort of movement, it's going to help wake up those tissues, those hip external rotators, to ensure the hips in place, the knees in place, the ankles in place, and it carries down the lower limbs, which plays a massive role in ACL tear prevention, because ACL get torn by internal rotation. So by strengthening and waking up those external rotators, it's going to prevent that heavily. So this plays a massive role in my movement preparation. And then, as well as waking up the nervous system or neural activation, I've got a picture in there on the top right here. It's just someone jumping over a small ladder, things like that. So something explosive like that is going to excite the muscles and excite the tissue and excite the nervous system, and have them ready for whatever sort of loaded capacity that it is, again, regardless if it's sprinting or lifting. So I put this picture, and I chose this carefully because a lot of coaches are using ladders or even just small hurdles, things like this. I choose to try and use very minimal apparatuses. Something like this is fine, but ladders, I have a bit of an issue with ladders, and this comes from my personal football playing experiences. I try not to teach any athletes to look down. So for example, look at this bloke here, he's looking forward. This is something I try not to teach, as well as this guy here looking down. Obviously, if they need to put a visual to what their limbs are doing, then yeah, look down. But for example, ladders, I don't use ladders because I try to keep them looking up at all times. I try not to train that habit, because as a player, if I'm on a park and I look up and I'm looking at my opponent or the guy that I'm matched up with, and as soon as I see the bloke looking down, I don't know if it's the dirty side of my football career or not, but I'm going to try and take him out because he doesn't see me coming. I'm going to take the ball and take him with me. So I try not to teach any athletes to look down at all, because I don't want to create any sort of habits like that. And there's really no sport that you should be looking down at all. So I try and choose my exercises carefully when it comes to nervous system activation. So something like this is pretty straightforward and pretty easy to administer too. So then the last property of my warm-up is tissue temperature. So we got the big wallabies over here doing their dynamic warm-up. So the idea of this is obviously warm up the tissue, warm up the fascial lines, as well as internally warm up the body as well. So by doing a carefully constructed dynamic warm-up, as long as you're not holding any static movements for too long, you're going to maintain elasticity in the muscles, which will help keep power output up, as well as sprint performance up. And that's the studies that back it up. And there's hundreds of research that shows that, dynamic exercises prior to sprint performance is going to, maintain high levels of elasticity. And I think that's becoming such an obvious thing in every sport, is really implementing dynamic warm-ups now. But the reason why I put this in here is because I choose my dynamic warm-ups and I choose the exercises very carefully. I make sure that they're mainly compound exercises. And they're mainly exercises that are going to be chosen for the actual movement. So for example, if I'm going to do max squat, regardless if it's front or back, I'm going to probably have overhead squat in a warm-up. So you've got your compound movement. It's going to wake up the upper body, the upper back, the stabilizers, as well as prepare the lower limbs and muscles for the movements and get a full range of motion in there. And then that's also part of a screen, which I'm going to touch on a little bit here. So here's the screen portion of it. So dynamic movement screen. So I've got two definitions here. This top one here is the definition of a dynamic warm-up, and the bottom one is the definition of what a screen is. So the dynamic warm-up is a series of movements designed to prepare the body for activity, right? And I just discussed that. And then what a screen is a series of movement patterns to identify muscle imbalances or weaknesses, right? So I'm going to use FMS for example, because again, going back to the collegiate setting, FMS is something that's, they say it's validized, it's not quite validized, but it is universal across the board and it is standardized across a lot of universities. So, and it's implemented by, a huge majority of universities. So, and the idea is it's the FMS, it's 7 exercises, and you grade their movement patterns and try and identify muscle imbalances and weaknesses. So it teaches you to get a bit of an eye for identifying these certain imbalances. So let's go back to it. These two definitions are so close that I found that I could almost implement them into one. So my dynamic warm-up is a series of movement patterns. So why can't I just use my trained eye as a coach and try and identify these muscle imbalances and weaknesses while I'm preparing the body for activity? Using my carefully chosen dynamic warm-up, I can get the best of both of these. So it's going to be, you're going to save a lot of time. And the reason why I think this is more beneficial, which I'll actually discuss on my next slide. I'll get into a little bit more detail. But I've got a nice little quote here from Gray Cook, who's a movement specialist, works very closely with Mike Ball. Mobility before stability, stability before movement, and here's a nice pyramid. Movement being, strength or any sort of movement, sprint it could be, any sort of, high demand movement patterns. But mobility comes first, stability comes second, and then movement. So now I'm going to talk about why that. So here's the reasons why I choose to use a dynamic screen prior. It's going to tell you a little bit more about the person and their readiness on a daily basis. So the FMS seems to be implemented, and I'm going to use the university setting again, implemented either once or twice a year, sometimes 3 times a year. So it's going to tell you how they move in those 7 exercises on the day. So let's take, for example, if they do the FMS on a Friday, and they're in the middle of finals week, they're up all weekend, they're sitting in a chair all weekend studying. They come in Monday and they have the same workout that was, or a similar microcycle to the week before. They're not going to move the same because they just spent, 20, 30 hours sitting in a chair. So we're going to go back to what I was talking about earlier. They're going to have the tighter hip flexors now. And what they said on the FMS on the Friday may not be applicable on the Monday. Plus their movement may be even worse because they haven't slept so much. And I've got a nice little picture of this football player here is taking a little bit of a nap on the sidelines. So the reason why I choose a dynamic screen prior to any sort of movement pattern is because it's going to tell you how they look on the day. It's going to tell you their weaknesses and imbalances on the day, right? So again, like I was saying, it's going to show those tight muscles and short muscles, and it's going to tell you a little bit about what they've been doing and how they've been moving and how they've been looking after themselves. You're only seeing these athletes 3, maybe 4, 5 hours a week out of a 168-hour week, right? So you're not going to get a good idea of what they're doing until they start moving. And doing an FMS 10 minutes out of the year is going to tell you such a small portion of it, and it's not going to give you, that dynamic setting. Whereas the FMS is very static, it's not going to give you the dynamic setting. So the FMS will tell you in a static setting how they move, but it's not going to tell you how well of a sprinter they are, because it's so static compared to sprinting or something of high velocity that's very dynamic. Right, so as well as that, by screening them during the dynamic setting, you're going to see what the dysfunction in their fascia is. So, as they're doing some sort of forward lunge with a twist, and if they've got a tightness or a dysfunction, their movement patterns are going to be different. And this is something you've got to have a really eye for. You've got to be aware of what you're looking for and how to address that. And then another portion of the screen is I'm always throwing some sort of proprioception in there, and that may be the same as the nervous system activation portion, where they're doing jumps. I might throw some single leg jumps in there, laterally or forwardly or whatever. And again, it comes down to what the workout is. But I'm going to throw that in there because it's going to, if they've slept 2 hours a night, and this is a collegiate setting, they've slept 2 hours a night because they're studying all night, they're going to have very, very poor proprioception. They're not going to be able to balance on one leg. And what's that going to tell me? If I'm looking at my card, my microcycle here, and they've got a 1 RM today, and they've slept, barely anything, and then, so during their warm-up, I'm watching them, they're a little bit lethargic, they're a little bit tight in their hip flexors, we may still be able to get to it. All right, let's get some proprioception. All right, they can't even balance on one leg at the minute, so that scratches my whole workout. I'm not going to put them under a bar for a 1 RM squat if they're all, short and they're all shortening their hip flexors, and they've got multiple dysfunctions, their fascial lines, and then they have zero readiness for the session. So again, that's a reason why I choose to do this on a daily basis rather than a couple of times a year, because I'm going to be able to get the best benefit of my athletes on the day. So here's an example of a full warm-up. So I've got my tissue quality here, my SMR my fascia release, which is full body foam rolling. So starting from the calves, working your way up. Could be anything, PVC pipe, foam roller, any of those fancy ones, it doesn't matter. Trigger point if necessary. So this is still part of the tissue quality. So now, depending on the athlete, so now this is where my compliance slide comes into play here. So let's say you've got a group of football players that are in a lower back program because they've got a very fragile lower back, or shoulder program because they've got very poor shoulders. Right, it's the job of the athletic trainer and the sport coach to comply with the strength and conditioning coach to help implement a program that's gonna hit, the injury prevention portion of their role. So here's what I would do if this was me. So if I had a bunch of guys in a shoulder, rehab group, and the athletic trainer, if they're in their umbrella sports performance setting, they're gonna tell me, okay, this guy's got a poor shoulder, right? So then I'm going to implement a something like over here, a pec minor trigger point. If they're in a lower back, I'm probably going to do trigger point piriformis, TFL, and probably glute med too. And that's just going to be implemented on their program. But the biggest thing is compliance here. If you're unaware of what's going on, it's hard to implement these and make it so they go through their session in a timely fashion. If you're standing around talking to the athlete for 10 minutes about where they're sore and what's going on, you take a chunk of your workout on there, and in the collegiate setting, you're on a time frame here. Anyway, so the next portion is a static mobility. So this is tissue length. So this is mobilizing the joint as well as lengthening the muscles in a static form. So again, this is my big hip flexor thing here. I try and hit at least 2 out of the 3 big areas, being ankle, hip, and shoulder. So hip is generally hip flexors. Ankle can be a 3-way ankle mobility, 4-way ankle mobility, and then shoulders, normally something for the scapula, and then something for the actual joint as well. Then we've got the activation, which is tissue activation, which is muscular and neurological. So this is where the nervous system gets excited, as well as waking up those specific muscle groups prior to movement. And then I've got my tissue temperature, which is my dynamic warm-up / screen, which I've spoken about. Okay, so now you've got an idea of how I plan a movement prep and the properties of it. So my basic warm-up normally takes about 15-20 minutes, right? If they're belting through what they need to, and that's considering the trigger point and everything. So some things I've taken into account in a collegiate setting is time. Now, is it very realistic to go through a 20-minute warm-up and try and cram in a 40-minute workout in there? Now, again, I'm going to touch on compliance for a second, because I know sport coaches that don't have a sports science background, they're going to approach the strength and conditioning specialist and say, okay, I need this guy to be powerful. I need him to move 225 on the bench. I need him to be able to sprint a 440, and they're going to ask you to work on every aspect in one training session. Now, it's not realistic, and it does take time. Athletes only have 4 years, and which only gives sports performance coaches 4 years to try and get the best out of them. So again, this comes to compliance. If the sports coach understands that the sports performance is in a setting where they need to apply certain things, and they need to have different focuses and different microcycles and mesocycles throughout the year, it comes down to time. So I see this as one of the biggest things to try and get past is time. So for a lot of the programs, and a lot of the athletes, they want to be doing like accessory or even auxiliary lifts that are in isolation. So something like a bicep curl, tricep push down, things like that. Now it's up to a sports performance coach. Okay, what's more important here? What's a priority? Go back to your 3 roles in as a sports performance coach. It's injury prevention. So what's more important, to implement a 1 to 2 minute trigger point process, or 1 to 2 minutes of mobility, or 3 minutes at the end of a workout to pump the guns up a bit, to get some bis and tris in there. So what's more important? And I know what's more important for me. It's going to be injury prevention. So reevaluate priorities. All right. So, and it's a matter of, and again, if you want to get the best of both worlds, if you did want to get the gun show in for a psychological reason, it makes the athletes feel better, then look, use one of your sessions, that's considered a recovery day, to teach all the athletes how to trigger point, how to foam roll, and just have everyone on the same page. If the compliance is a tier system, okay, then treat everyone like a shoulder rehab, treat everyone like a lower back prehab. Better be safe than sorry. Teach everyone how to trigger point at piriformis, and then have all the athletes come in 10 minutes prior to the lift starts and trigger point at piriformis and trigger point at pec minor, and then you still get the full hour. Then you can still get your gun show at the end for 5 minutes. So again, it's about how you approach the situation and how you prioritize your exercises and how you prioritize your session, which again, compliance and what I spoke on. So when I presented this presentation to the Purdue University sports performance staff, here's some of the questions that I got as I was finishing up. So why not tissue temperature prior to tissue quality? So why not do a slow warm-up or a jog or some sort of movement to elevate the core temperature prior to tissue quality? Now, I understood this question because that would be the idealistic world, because fascia does manipulate better when it's warm. However, I have tried to apply this before. I have athletes go for jogging and then come and foam roll, and it does slow the flow down a little bit, and it does change the energy, so it's not very realistic. Although it may be a little bit of a better approach as far as tissue quality goes, it's not super realistic to get the athletes jogging around and building up a bit of energy and then have them sit down and foam roll for 3-4 minutes and then have them, stretch, tissue length for another couple minutes. It just brings the energy right down again, and it's hard to kind of flip-flop that energy level. So I find that if they do all the slower stuff first, you're still getting good tissue quality out of it, and you're still getting good tissue length out of it, and then start to build up, and then build the energy up during tissue temperature, so when they go into their primary moves, they're absolutely ready to go, not just physiologically, but psychologically as well. The next question I got is, there a way to regulate or validate a dynamic screen? So again, I use a lot of FMS as an example and as a comparison here. And because that's on a grading system. Look, when I kind of plan my dynamic portion or property, I try and choose exercises that are the same across the board and that are compound and that can be screened across the board. And I generally only change it to either one or two different lots. So, for example, if you're going into a sprint day, you've got a linear warm-up or a lateral warm-up. So I'll have kind of the same thing, either linear or lateral, or sometimes I just call it 1 and 2, and if they're on a 4-day split, they do 1, 2, 1, 2. So it keeps it somewhat regulated, so I know what to look for every single time. And then one of the recommendations I got is you could kind of regulate and validate those by giving a grading system, which I've tried before on a little bit more of a descriptive level. So I've had a look at the athlete and looked how they move through all my movements that I have set, and then I'll just take notes on poor things that I find. Not the good things, just the poor things. So then I know to either, depending on how severe it is, to work on that immediately or work on that after the session or even the next day. But I've tried that, and that's pretty effective too. But as far as grading it goes, I don't know, and I haven't tried it, and it may be a little bit hard in a bigger setting, like one-on-one it works, and small groups it works. But if you've got a football team in a university, so American football team, there's 80 blokes starting to warm up at the same time, and it's hard to stand there and regulate and try and grade everyone on a daily basis. Again, you've got to have the eye for it, and it's kind of hard, so I try and make it very, very quick by just getting an eye for it, and if I see something that's really off, I'll say, alright, just take a minute and go roll or trigger point this area and then come back. So another question I got, can this be applied without the umbrella sports performance model? So the umbrella is what I was talking about with Dr. Craig Duncan. He talks about everyone complying with each other. Yeah, it can. Ideally, I find that if everyone's complying and everyone sees himself on the same level, not as superiors or inferiors, it's obviously a lot better across the board. But in the system that a lot of American colleges use, where it's in a tier system where there are superiors and inferiors, I mean, it's not as beneficial, but this process still can be applied in that setting. I still believe, you can get it as long as you are communicating as well. So, I mean, for example, if you plan to, implement a 15-20 minute warm-up with trigger points, and you have your sport coaches walking in, and, they've given you the expectations of, all right, these guys need to be bench pressing 225 by this day. And, they walk in and see your session, you got guys just lying around on foam rollers or just, lying static on a ball because they're in a trigger point setting. It looks bad if you haven't communicated it. So I think it can be applied without this setting, but there still has to be a level of compliance and buy-in and trust when it comes to, you know, what you're applying to your workouts. But you know, I guess it's kind of scenario based too, because you know a lot of schools have their way and their way only, so it really kind of depends on what they're looking. So I mean, what if FMS is the standardized program that's across the university program? So the question I got was, if I were to walk into another university and I got a job at another university, and you know, obviously they're in a tier system, and the director of sports performance says, no, FMS is our thing. There's no need to watch the athletes in a dynamic setting. It kind of throws a lot what I'm saying out the window, but that doesn't go to say I'm not, you know, looking after my athletes. Still, the roles of a sports performance coach does not change. You're still number one priority is to look after the athletes. You're still number one priority is to prevent them from getting injured. So you take the FMS standards, you take their scores, and then, I mean, guess what I do? I'm going to, you know, if it says they're tighten their hip flexors or whatever you're looking for, that the FMS gives you from their scores, I'm going to work on those during the dynamic warm-up. So if the FMS is telling me that they have, I don't know, poor hip mobility, okay, then guess what my warm-up's going to look like? I'm going to hit some hip mobility, and I'm going to almost retest every session. So I'm going to do overhead squats almost every session to try and get those. I'm going to do a regress version of an overhead squat as a dynamic warm-up, and then I'm just going to get them better at it. So then when it does come to their FMS time, it does come to their testing phase, my athletes have improved. So then you go back to your director of sports performance and say, sure, yeah, you've implemented a dumbed down or varied version of your dynamic warm-up and your dynamic screen, but you're focused it around the FMS score. I mean, if it's that subjective and that's what they want, then you can make that work. But yeah, those are some of the questions I got. So that about wraps it up for me. I'll finish off with this screen here if you want to see some of the references. But yeah, thanks everyone for watching. Thanks everyone for listening. I appreciate the time. I did go a little bit longer than I wanted to, but hopefully I did kind of cover everything. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email, which you can find on my website. Feel free to, you know, text me, call me, whatever it is. So thanks guys, appreciate it.